Philosophy and Theory lecture. My name is Julian. I'm going to be hosting this for about 45 minutes. We're joined by students from around the world on both Instagram and YouTube. Let me introduce Instagram to YouTube. Hello, hello, hello. I'm really looking forward to this today. I feel like I have pretty good energy. If you're new to this, sorry about my hair. If you're new to this is a weekly introduction to Zizek, Hegel, Marx, Lacan, Freud, Fichte, Kant, Plato. It's a weekly introduction to continental philosophy and theory series that I've been hosting for the past 2 years already. We're currently midway through a lecture series called Spurious Infinities, about the so-called false universal that Hegel accuses Fichte of having, and which becomes a key part of Zizek's interpretation of Hegel and his accusations apropos post-Marxism and postmodernism. Now, you don't need to know anything about that to enjoy this lecture. I'm going to try to make this lecture something that works for beginners as well, something that can be intuitively enjoyed by people who have relatively little familiarity with philosophy. However, the main goal of this series is to take very difficult concepts and abstract ideas and hopefully make them relatable and accessible so that by the end of this lecture, both the beginner and the more advanced reader will hopefully be satisfied. As per usual, I'd like to say thank you to all of our patrons. I'm looking at you, YouTube. I'm looking at you, Instagram. Thank you to all of the patrons who keep this project alive, this open access educational lecture series, which I simply couldn't do without your support. So huge thank you to all the patrons who keep this project going. If you'd like to become a patron, there's a whole bunch of perks you can access, including audio downloads for every YouTube video I make. That's audio downloads for daily YouTube philosophy explainers. You can access our Discord, which I've been told has become a very lively community. You can access a podcast that I record as a Q&A session, like a seminar after each lecture, which I also post for patrons. Of course, you can also find my ebook it's an ebook subscription service on my Patreon, and a whole bunch more. So thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you for supporting this project. As per usual, if you really want to do me a favor that costs you absolutely nothing and yet brings me enormous amounts of joy, please do leave a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. That is the dream for me. Like, I know this makes me naive and old-fashioned, but the idea that through philosophy we could be connecting with each other across the world and starting our week in, I don't know, in an intellectually curious fashion makes me truly happy. So I'm very curious to hear where you're joining us from. I'd really love it if you left a comment letting us know. I see Mexico. Hello, Mexico. That's amazing. Manila, the usual guy from Manila. I recognize you. I recognize your profile picture. Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Is the podcast on Spotify yet? No, we keep it on Patreon because it is a Q&A based on the lectures. So I really see it as like a seminar that we host together with students. India, hello. Algeria, that's incredible. We don't get a lot of Algerian students. India, England. Hello, England, the Philippines, holding down the fort in Florida. That's very nice. Moscow, greetings to Moscow. India, again, Kazakhstan. Hello, Kazakhstan. That's amazing. Pakistan. I once had a beautiful message from a student in Pakistan who told me that he actually had to travel to access an internet connection to watch these classes, which made me feel very humbled. Not to suggest that people don't have internet in Pakistan, but this particular student had that issue. So thank you for making the time for being here. More Pakistani students, that's incredible. Egypt, hello. Namaste. All right, that's incredible. South Africa, that's very beautiful. Thank you guys so much. I could do this for an entire hour, as you know. It really makes me feel so wonderfully connected to you, and that's why I do this. I see London. I lived in London for nearly 10 years. Very fond of London. Okay, so let's begin because there's a whole bunch I want to do today. This is going to be a lecture focusing on what you might call the problem with postmodernism. And it builds upon a lecture that I hosted a couple weeks ago, which I called Zizek versus Postmodernism. And today I want to talk a little bit more, and hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be familiar with some of the main differences between modernism and postmodernism, both within arts and within philosophy, the interconnection thereof. The manner in which Zizek conceptualizes 3 types of transcendentalism, so-called naive transcendentalism, transcendental transcendentalism, if you will, and then a kind of Lacanian transcendentalism of the real, which of course relates to Hegelian speculative idealism. Again, you don't need to know these terms right now. I hope the lighting is sort of okay. I don't know if with this, no, this better, okay. So we're gonna cover all of that and more. So stick around, this is gonna be about 40-45 minutes. And if you wanna download this session, I'm gonna be posting it to my Patreon, and I save all the videos so you can watch them anytime you want. So I wanna start with one of my favorite movies, which is a film by one of my favorite directors, Paolo Sorrentino, who I believe to be one of the greatest directors working today. And he has a film for which he won, I think, Best Foreign Picture, and it's called La Grande Bellezza, which is translated to the Grand Beauty. And the movie opens with a writer who has stopped writing. He doesn't see the point of writing, which is, of course, a trope within fiction, right? The writer who doesn't write. And he's instead become a journalist, and he interviews local artists for the paper. And in this case, he's interviewing a woman who's a performance artist, who's sort of loosely styled after Marina Abramovich, if that's her name. And part of the performance is that on the outskirts of Rome, she blindfolds herself and she runs headfirst into a brick wall. In fact, a brick wall that is part of the Roman aqueduct. And she runs into the brick wall, bashes herself on the head, and falls over. And says something like, "I don't love you." So after this performance art, which of course elicits great gasps from the audience, the journalist goes into a tent and interviews the artist. And he asks her about some of the incentives of her art, why she does it, what it means, etc. And in characteristically sort of slightly defiant artistic fashion, right? Artists don't like talking about what they mean by their art. She says that she can't really explain it, but that she senses vibrations. And it is at this exact point that the journalist becomes annoyed, and he starts pressing her, and he starts saying, "What do you mean by vibrations?" And she says, "Well, I just get vibrations that tell me to run into the wall." And then he says, "Lady, you cannot expect that our educated readership of this paper will understand or believe what you mean by vibrations." And then the woman sort of bursts into tears, and the artist, and she says, "Well, I don't know what it means either," etc., etc. In this ironic scene, which is thereby a postmodern scene, because it is a scene about the problem of postmodernism, and we'll get to that in a moment, we have one of the classic problems that both modernism and postmodernism deal with. What she calls vibrations are, namely, how do you deal with the content of art? What is the point or the purpose of art as such? What is it that you wish to depict? And after modernism, and we'll explain in a moment what modernism is, after the turn away from the transcendental content of art towards the emphasis on the form of art, thereby to resuscitate the idea of content in a seemingly disavowed form, namely vibrations, is a kind of kitsch. And that is the point of the scene, that a lot of postmodernism is in fact kitschy, that it has an element of kitsch. Now, those are a lot of terms, so I'm going to try to explain those and break them down for you. And then by the end of it, we can see how that relates back to Zizek's argument about Hegel. Now, first, let's break down some of the key distinctions between modernism and postmodernism. There's entire books dedicated to this, but of course, I have my own interpretation thereof. So basically what we see is that within modernism, anything that is modernist is something in which there exists a tension between the content and its form, which itself becomes content. In other words, the content of modernism is something that blurs the line between form and content. Now, what do I mean by form and content? Before we get to the philosophical argument, let's just think it purely in terms of framing. Malevich's Black Square, perhaps one of the most famous pieces of modernist art, has content. The content is a black square. However, the black square is also the frame, right? The frame that would usually enframe what is depicted, the content. And so the content of the painting becomes synonymous with its form. This means that you can no longer determine if it is content or if it is form. Hence, what we have here is essentially the content of the form, which is the irredeemable dialectical substance of content versus form, to put it in fancy terms. So Malevich's Black Square is modernism in that sense, in that the very point, the very content of what is depicted is the impossibility of seeing what is form and what is content, what is frame and what is depicted within the frame. Now we can juxtapose that to, for example, Duchamp's famous urinal, which is already postmodern. Now, what makes it postmodern? Essentially, Duchamp, by taking an ordinary object, I'm sure you've seen it, not just an ordinary object, but an object that is associated with the kind of like obscene element, namely the fact that it is something that is kept out of the private eye. It is where men go to piss, as it were, and that the urinal is elevated to the objet of art, to not to say objet art, but the objet art here. The ironic twist, of course, is that here we no longer have Malevich's Black Square. We no longer have a painting that is both form and content, or a dialectical mediation between form and content as content. Instead, it is simply the somewhat cynical assumption, and yet important one, which is anything equals art. Anything can become art. The lowest objects can become the highest. So we have an ironic engagement, which you might even find within Sorrentino's movies quite frequently, between the highest and the lowest, between the sacred and the profane. And thereby Duchamp's urinal essentially posits that if we treat art like the sacred, then we have to also juxtapose it with the profane. The profane elevated to the level of art. Here you can actually see a link to Lacan's definition of the sublime, which thereby reveals itself as being unintentionally postmodern avant la lettre, and yet we'll find out in a moment why it is in fact structuralist and so modern, which is the object elevated to the level of the thing. That when you take an ordinary object like the urinal and you put it in a museum, then it becomes the thing, the object of art as such. Now what's really interesting here is that we have here kind of like an impossible division, right? On the one hand, Malevich's Black Square, form and content and dialectical tension with each other, and the urinal, namely object elevated to art, the profane that becomes sacred, a postmodern ironic twist on the idea of content and the manner in which the museum itself has a kind of hidden form. And here we can actually argue in favor of postmodernism. Now, because think about it, traditionally the critique of ideology, if you go back to like the beginnings of the critique of ideology, whether it's in Nietzsche or in Adorno or in Althusser, most importantly, the easiest and yet also most difficult to understand definition, because that's often how philosophy works, that the easier you make it, the harder it becomes. In fact, that the definition of philosophy might well be something of which it is hard to understand that it is easy. The definition of ideology is not just looking at the form, nor at the content, but the manner in which there is a hidden content in the form itself. This is what today's leftists would call, or even liberals would call, structural injustice, structural violence. This is the content within the form, namely that which is repressed or that which is made to be invisible has its own hidden content. Now, when it comes to postmodernism, or when it comes to Duchamp, thereby the critique of ideology, namely the critique or the awareness of the hidden content within the form itself, is the fact that the museum, the backdrop upon which this art is staged, is itself a kind of frame. That as soon as you take an object and you put it in a museum, it thereby momentarily appears to become art. And so Malevich's Black Square relates to the form and content within the painting, the frame and the content. The postmodern turn is to say, let's look instead at the manner in which the location of the painting itself frames the painting as art. And so we have an additional level here. And here's actually where there's a joke that Zizek makes about this that I've never seen anybody repeat, so I'd really like to add it here. Zizek says that thereby, if you took Malevich's Black Square and if you took Duchamp's urinal and you placed it within Malevich's Black Square, what would thereby seemingly be like the new avant-garde after postmodernism, like a post-postmodernism, is instead a return to classical transcendental art. Namely, that you would have the object of worship, the sacred as the profane, back within the ordinary frame of the black background. And that's, of course, what kitsch is. The easiest definition for me of kitsch has nothing to do with taste. It's simply that whenever we've had a revolution within thought or a revolution within art, something that structurally changes the central axis and axioms of the manner in which we participate in art, and you ignore that revolution, for example, let's say that modernism happens, and after that you simply go back to like doing transcendental landscape painting. This becomes kitsch. It's very unfair because kitsch thereby isn't really like doing anything bad. It's simply ignoring a revolution that has taken place. In the same manner that, for example, a couple of years ago, or 10 years ago by now, the best movie, the Oscar for Best Picture went to, it was called like The Artist or something, like a seemingly like a silent movie, like a black and white movie. This was kitsch. It was kitsch because it essentially upheld a kind of nostalgia for a moment within cinema that had already been surpassed. And so kitsch is when you ignore a revolution that has taken place within a specific art form or within a specific train of thought. Hence also the irony that if you dialectically mediated the urinal, namely the object elevated to the thing, the postmodern Duchampian gesture, and you posited it against the backdrop of Malevich's Black Square, you would actually have returned back to the kitsch, namely transcendental art, a seemingly neutral black square against which we posit a holy object. But this is the problem of postmodernism, because that would itself also be a postmodern gesture. And so the very return to that which was surpassed becomes regurgitated or integrated into what thereby would be postmodern. That the only properly postmodern gesture towards Duchamp would thereby not be to create more objects as art, to say anything is art, but precisely to stage it against the backdrop of modernism. And so here we have the Ouroboros eating its own tail, essentially. That postmodernism presents a kind of deadlock where in order to be properly postmodern, you end up becoming kitsch. It's like kitsch, rather than being that which was forestalled by the progression of modernism, becomes regurgitated within postmodernism. Think about Tarantino, for example. Tarantino is like one of the definitive postmodern directors because the manner in which he takes film is to make it all about meta references to other movies and ironic references that take place within his films, and that thereby part of the enjoyment of his movies is to have an awareness of those meta narratives, not just structurally in how the story is told, which by now is already kind of passé, right? Think about Christopher Nolan's early movies like Memento doing the same thing, or you could even say here the most recent movie, Tenet having a chiasmic structure, which is kind of interesting. These are purely formalistic exercises. And so one of the ironies, and this is what Hegel would have accused Tarantino of, I'm sure, namely of having spurious infinities or false universals, is that postmodernism ends up in a deadlock where what the progression from postmodernism or within postmodernism is in fact a kind of disavowed formalism, a return to formalism. That is one of the key aspects, key problems within the postmodern, is that postmodernism, when taken to its logical extreme, becomes formalism. It regresses back into formalism. Now, there's a couple of things that we can extrapolate from this, but actually, to stick with movies for one more moment, I want to give you an example of where modernism exists already within one of the. Let me put it slightly differently. So, what is one of the traditional, most well-known American genres of filmmaking? The Western. And this is why, of course, it took an Italian like Ennio Morricone to actually make a modernist Western. So what does a modernist Western look like? Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in the West has one of the most indicative sequences of modernism within filmmaking, which works beautifully. And it is also the line where we see a sort of transition from modernism to postmodernism avant la lettre. Now, what is this scene? Essentially, at a certain point in Once Upon a Time in the West, the villain shows up. We see like a beautiful prairie landscape where we have an idyllic, romanticized notion of the American West, of course, here set in Italy. And a little boy goes to like get a pitcher of water, and his mother is in the background on the porch, etc. And then we hear gunshots, and this frame, this romantic transcendental frame, is ruptured. All of a sudden, there is violence in the air. We don't know where it's coming from. The young boy is struck down. He is killed. Already a shocking instance of seemingly meaningless and, of course, meaningless violence in cinema. And so we don't know what's happened. The transcendental frame of the Western romantic movement has been shattered and ruptured. And then we start seeing a figure coming out of the brush. And when the figure emerges, what we have is a frame lacking interpretation. There is a completely neutral frame that gives us no indication whether this is in fact the hero or the villain, except for a meta-reference, which is that the main character who plays the villain, spoilers, who is the villain, is played by one of the quintessential actors of American Western heroism. It's a little bit like if Tom Cruise suddenly showed up and we didn't realize yet that Tom Cruise was the villain. And so here we have the neutral frame, namely of the actor who is associated with being the hero, but potentially a villain. And the music that plays is the theme for the villain. And here we have a beautifully transitional moment between modernism and postmodernism. Modernism, the disruption of the naive transcendental frame, of the content of Western movie style romanticism, versus the almost uncanny emergence of a postmodern self-referential process by which we as viewers are not just manipulated, but are drawn into the interplay of form versus content. Namely, our assumptions, or the generation of viewers who would have seen it in the cinema, our assumptions about the hero are used against us. And ironically, against the backdrop of this confusion, we see thereby, or we hear, to be precise, the theme song or the leitmotif of the villain. And that is like, if you go back in the history of cinema, it's one of the key sequences. Tarantino would not be possible without that sequence. This level of meta-referentiality that becomes its own form of content, or literally a form which becomes content. And so what we have here essentially is the positing of three types of frames. We have a transcendental or naive frame, namely in which the content is simply content an sich, as such. It is the romantic depiction of the ideal. Then we have the transition into something which ruptures or disrupts this frame, in which the disruptor becomes its own form of content, like Malevich's Black Square, or the shot ringing through the desert without a villain being clearly seen. And then we have the transition into postmodernism, the postmodern moment in which the self-referential play of form becomes its own content. And the problem thereby is that once you've surpassed this postmodern moment, any attempt to continue to be postmodern becomes spurious. It becomes a kind of false infinity by which everything becomes a meta-referential of that which has come before. And the only progress is further irony, further variations on a theme. Now, I want to take some of those ideas and start exploring them from a philosophical lens. But I hope that so far this makes sense. Recently, I went to a exhibit of American Impressionism. And what was very interesting about it is that, to me, American Impressionism tells the truth of what you might call the lie of Impressionism. Now, first, I'm 100% someone who admires Impressionism. Impressionism is not just a beautiful moment within the history of art, but also a really necessary one. If you think about it, the entire debate, in fact, this is a debate that I had recently with my own father, is the question, is Impressionism modernist or not? Is Impressionism modernism? In other words, does Impressionism, which is what it appears to do, namely, think about like one of the classic strategies or techniques of Impressionistic painting, which is instead of painting one moment in the day, you paint all the moments in the day as if they were one. It's like you take the classical form of like plein air painting and you go outside, but instead of painting the sublime entity of nature as it appears to you, you paint it as it is in the constant flux of appearing. In other words, every Impressionist painting is a kind of sublime in the Kantian sense in that it depicts something which cannot be properly represented. Instead of the Burkean sublime, which we covered last week, by which the natural landscape becomes a trickle down of the absolute or the ideal. We even find this within Romanticism, right? This is the famous image of Turner's Romanticism, or man gazing into the storm, that the storm represents like the ultimate unscrutable, unknowable nature of the absolute coming out in full force and being pondered by man. Here, that would be the Burkean sublime. The Kantian sublime is much closer to the Impressionist, which is to say the sublime lies precisely within the fact that it cannot be represented in painting. And so the very project of peinture, to be a little bit here like pretentious, is to say I will paint something as it appears to me throughout the day in one moment. Thereby, some Impressionist works become a marker of the futility of realist landscape painting, right? That's how you would traditionally interpret Impressionism, as a kind of modernist reaction towards realism. And yet, when I went to the exhibit of American Impressionism, I saw the truth of Impressionism. Of course, I'm being a bit provocative here, which is that Impressionism was the perfect commodity for the American art market. In fact, the idea of Impressionism within the United States, rather than being a modernist, outrageous critique of traditional transcendental art and materialism, became something that was sufficiently obtuse and abstract that it could be made to fit in every home, that it was something that looked good on every wall, and that in fact the creation of a market for Impressionism in the United States became part of the historical context of the manner in which Impressionism became so famous. It's also why you can buy Christmas cards that are Impressionist, and you can buy pastel-colored calendars and coffee mugs and scarves and shawls and pretty much everything. If you put an Impressionist picture on it, looks nice. And here we have one of the problems, which is, again, I love Impressionism deeply. I find it very interesting. But suddenly we have the moment of Impressionism as commodity, the moment of Impressionism as not just a critique or rebuttal of realist painting, but instead the reemergence of realist painting in its kind of false universal form. Everybody can own it, everybody can understand it. If you step back a couple of feet, it looks really pretty, and so on and so forth. Which isn't to say that art should be ugly or that art should be challenging and controversial and that you shouldn't be able to put it in your home. None of that is true. But instead, the funny thing is here that instead of making, it's much harder to imagine somebody putting a print of Malevich's Black Square in their kitchen than it is to imagine somebody putting an impressionistic picture in their kitchen. Now, why am I making this argument? The argument I'm trying to make here is that what thereby appears to us as modernist, and is indeed somewhat modernist within Impressionism, cannot make the leap towards a full modernist gesture or postmodern gesture. That it remains stuck within a kind of longing, a romantic longing for the transcendental. And that the romanticism that remains implicit within Impressionism is thereby one of the main forms of its weaknesses, but also precisely how romanticism becomes kitsch today. That if you embrace the idea of Impressionism as a return to when art was beautiful, not only have you thereby disavowed the central forward thrust of Impressionism, which was to rebut the idea of traditional landscape painting, but specifically also you've thereby rendered Impressionism, which was supposed to be modernist, into what it is not, into transcendental, naive idealism within art. Hence it becomes kitsch. And so here we have again this problem, which is that an art movement that can be incredibly profound and important in its own moment can reveal itself retroactively as kitsch. And what's really interesting is you go to an impression, like an exhibit of the Impressionists, Monet, etc., even Pissarro, and then you go to the American Impressionists, and without in any way wanting to be a snob about this, because it has nothing to do with European or continental versus American, you realize how Impressionism finds its true form as kitsch within the American art market. And of course, that kitsch, which is then sold back to the European art market. And it's like this beautiful, to me, like very beautiful, slightly ironic inversion that takes place. Now, why am I introducing all this? Basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explain or get to a moment. I don't know how much time we have. Oh, we're good. We're good on time. I want to get to a moment where we can make an argument that Zizek has about the Lacanian real, about Kantian formalism, about Hegel, about all these things. So let me try to explain that and unpack it a little bit. Essentially, Zizek posits that we have three types of transcendental attitudes. We have the naive transcendental attitude, which he thereby associates with Plato and the Platonic approach to the transcendental. Allegory of the cave, truth exists outside the cave, within the cave is the world of illusion. There's a meme that's been going around online that I really like, which is a meme of it's a cropped face of a young woman, and it says, "Plato, please let me back into the cave," which I really like. Essentially, Zizek would agree with this, that in order to be a philosopher today and to embrace the post-metaphysical turn of Hegel, you have to be let back into the cave. So this is the naive transcendental approach, that we have to sort of go out of the cave and we have to find the truth. Hence also the problematic aspect of like this red pilling, that you are the one precious person who has seen the truth and that you have to wake up. And then when you have woken up, you can thereby be released. It's also a key component of Zizek's critique of ideology, with which you may already be familiar, which is that the most ideological gesture is always to offer you or to promise you an escape from ideology, that you could wake up from it, instead of seeing ideology as a kind of untraversable horizon. So that is the naive transcendentalism, which Zizek associates with Plato, pretty much all the way up to Kant. Kantian transcendentalism, namely as the critique of pure reason already indicates, the inquiry into the method or the conditions by which the absolute might be reached, is thereby no longer naive. It already becomes critical, it becomes self-reflective, it becomes transcendental. Now, transcendental here doesn't mean that it is naive. Transcendental and that it is looking for the conditions by which the absolute could be thought as concept by the reasoning subject. This is the turn from Plato towards Kant, the so-called Kantian Copernican turn. You probably know the Copernican turn is about the way in which we have the Galilean insight that it is not that the sun is revolving around the earth, but in fact that the earth is revolving around the sun. If we take these two central poles, sun and earth, and we apply them to the traditional metaphysical argument, namely the absolute or truth or something in itself or the noumenon, there's so many different words for describing the same thing essentially, and we relate that to the world of objects or subjectivity or reason or the phenomenon, this is the classic axis of naive metaphysics, naive transcendentalism. And the Kantian Copernican turn is to say that instead of having the sun revolving around the earth, right, we have the earth revolving around the sun. In the exact same manner that rather than having subjective reason rotating around the absolute, what if the absolute has to rotate around the subject? This is actually where we can understand a key part of Hegel that often goes undiscussed. Hegel argues that instead of having sublimely powerful nature, like absolute nature and pure, weak human minds, Hegel, in traditionally Hegelian fashion, inverts what appears to be a problem into its own solution. Namely, that it is in fact nature, or the absolute, that is weak, and that it is human reason that is absolute. In other words, that it is nature that has to be dialectically mediated through human reason. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's stick with Kant. So the Kantian Copernican turn is thereby no longer naive, because it upholds and posits that we have to, in order to even reach this transcendental moment of waking up into truth, we have to conceptualize the idea of the absolute. And that, strictly speaking, by means of conceptualizing it, we have thereby debased it. We have taken that which is holy and we've made it profane. Here you can actually see how the Kantian formalism mirrors in its opposite form the ironic postmodernism of Duchamp's urinal. Duchamp's urinal takes the supposedly profane object and elevates it to the level of the sublime, namely to the art object. Kant does the other thing, which is that he desublimates the idea of the absolute as being outside human reason and asks, what does it mean for the absolute to emerge within human reason itself? And when I make this comparison, it's really important to note that this isn't accidental. You really have to understand postmodernism and modernism as being part and parcel of the same lineage of philosophical and theological problems going all the way back to Kant and Plato. In fact, that when we lose sight of the manner in which these discussions are a part of art, we end up in the ironic scene at the beginning of The Grand Beauty, that the artist simply feels vibrations and that she taps into vibrations that give her messages. That is the trap. Okay, so Kantian formalism, essentially, thereby posits what are the conditions for understanding the manner in which the absolute can be known. Here we end up with the famous Kantian antinomies. The Kantian antinomy, if you want to make it really easy, is essentially the argument that we cannot know the absolute. That reason is the barrier towards the absolute. And so that the very idea of the naive transcendentalism, which was how do we reach the absolute? How do we transcend into like nirvana kind of state? Is impossible by the very fact that we have to think it. It's something that cannot be done. In other words, Kant posits that the in itself, because what's important here is that sometimes I mischaracterize this as like a transcendental horizon that exists in the sky versus like a debased world. Kant talks about what is the essence within objects themselves, the famous Ding an sich, or the things in themselves. And Kant essentially comes to the conclusion that we cannot know things in themselves. We cannot reach the absolute or essence. We're kind of stuck, and we're stuck within reason itself. Reason becomes the barrier towards the absolute. Ironically, this is very similar to what then within structuralism becomes a key part of Lacan's theory, but you can also find Claude Lévi-Strauss. Namely, that the question is thereby, do we speak language or does language speak us? And the Heideggerian, I've mentioned this before, but the Heideggerian maxim is that language is a house, that we live in it. And Lacan simply takes that and says language is a prison house. We are all prisoners of it. And the conclusion that Lacan draws from that, this is like his structural linguistics, is that it is not we who speak, but it is us who are spoken. And the manner in which we are spoken by language is what Lacan would thereby call the symbolic, the manner in which language begets more language, that language provides and facilitates the symbolic interaction with others, upon which is then predicated the idea of an imaginary relation to the self. Part of Lacan's famous triad of the imaginary, the symbolic, and what will ultimately appear to us as the real. And so within Kantian formalism, we have essentially this positing that it is the absolute remains inaccessible to us, that we as thinking, speaking subjects have no access to it. Here we have the transition from naive transcendentalism towards a kind of critical or reflective transcendentalism. By reflective, I don't mean reflective in like Marxist unity of opposites. I mean reflective in that it takes a self-critical stance towards the idea of transcendence itself, which is super important. Like, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that it's not saying, oh, Kant is an idiot and Hegel is a genius. On the contrary, Hegel would simply not be possible without Kant. Fichte would not be possible without Kant. Kant remains probably the most important thinker within the Western tradition of thought, and yet he only emerges as thus because of Hegel. In fact, not to be provocative here, but Hegel almost takes a postmodern turn on Kantian formalism. And let's get to that. So essentially, Kantian formalism posits a problem about the irreconcilable nature or relation between form and content. Content of the absolute, or the in itself. Form, the manner in which content is represented to us through concepts and reason, etc. And so if you will, we have within the lineage of the transcendental debate, we have within Kant what is thereby a precursor to modernism, a kind of what is seen as Kantian formalism is already a play, a juxtaposition of the problem of form itself, namely the manner in which content and form are supposedly irredeemably separated. They cannot be reconciled. Now you can start understanding why some people who misinterpret Hegel accuse Hegel of being a mysticist or a mystical thinker. The classic negative stereotype about Hegel is that he takes the Kantian formalistic problem of the relationship between content and form, and that he simply fuses them, and that he says that we're all these like automaton, we're all these mechanistic puppets, that we're following a trajectory of history that is predetermined. And yet nothing could be less true. In fact, all you have to do is read Hegel to understand that Hegel is arguing against this spurious infinite, that it is precisely Fichte who comes up with the quote-unquote solution to Kant by positing that the absolute lies like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow beyond the end of history itself. And that thereby to really pursue the absolute isn't to find it within the transcendental horizon of things in themselves, but to move towards a kind of perpetual, a kind of eternal recurrence that will lead us to an ideal endpoint. And so what Fichte does is that by naturalizing the idea or universalizing the idea of the absolute, he actually makes the absolute something that will always be outside of our grasp, and that thereby we have to move towards it. Hegel's argument, apropos Fichte, is that this is a kind of spurious infinity, or a false universal, that it has taken the absolute, which for Kant lay within the, or within or beyond the antinomies, it could not be reached by human reason, and instead of acknowledging this problem, it simply says, well, let's take the absolute and put it somewhere else, and we'll get there eventually. And so Hegel is precisely against the mysticism or the naturalism that we see within Fichte. Thereby, Hegel also argues against the Fichtean thesis, antithesis, synthesis. If you read thesis, antithesis, synthesis as content versus form versus content as form, you realize why Hegel would be against this. After all, if the absolute is content and form is reason, the manner in which we try to frame the content, thereby antithesis would be the reconciliation of form within content and content within form, what thereby would appear to be a dialectical mediation. Hegel might agree, except for one key difference. Hegel would never posit that content came first, that thesis came first before falling into form and then somehow mystically reuniting in content as form and form as content. Instead, for Hegel, the key aspect that Fichte misses is that the thesis, the supposedly a priori content, which for Kant falls into its form, namely the form of conceptualizing it, for Hegel, this starting point, the starting shot of the supposedly movement towards history of thesis, antithesis, synthesis has to itself be always already pre-mediated. In other words, what appears as thesis has to thereby be always already the reconciliation or dialectical mediation of an anteceding thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. In other words, thesis is its own synthesis, and thereby we can't have the argument content trickling down into form and from form emerging into a higher content. That would make no sense for Hegel. And so what Hegel posits instead is a kind of speculative idealism, a speculative idealism by which content, rather than existing to begin with, content has to emerge through its own fall, into form. In other words, this is how you can start seeing where Zizek makes the link between Lacan, the Critique of Ideology, and Hegel. After all, what was the Critique of Ideology, as I introduced before? The critique of the hidden content within the form itself, or the disavowed or repressed content within the structure. Structural injustice system. Thereby, the argument that Hegel makes has a component of the same mechanism of the Critique of Ideology. If the absolute thereby is not a priori and is regressed into Kantian formalism and then reaches a higher form in Fichtean antithesis, the unity of forms, instead for Hegel, we realize that the secret of transcendentalism is that there is no secret behind transcendentalism. In other words, to put that very clearly, or very clearly might be an overstatement here, to posit that between the dialectical mediation of form and content, we have the hidden content within the form itself. What is the hidden content within the form itself? This is what Hegel calls spirit. If thesis, antithesis, synthesis is content negating itself into form, then dialectically mediating into form as content and content as form, Hegel simply posits, why does it start with content? Who gets to say that content was first? What if content is always already, this is what Hegel calls a true universal, always already, itself pre-dialectized, pre-mediated by its own negation. And that thereby content, rather, and this is the key here that Zizek also argues, and I'll explain in a moment, rather than seeing form and content as being diametrically opposed and having to be reunified, what if content emerges only within the gap between form and content as such? That is the key argument and one of the central aspects of Zizek's reading of Hegel. Instead of the classic division between form and content, what if content lies within the gap between form and content itself? Now I can explain briefly why Zizek relates this to Lacan. In the Lacanian triad, which I touched upon before, between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real is never a plus one. The real is never simply excessive. The real is not simply the fact that the symbolic and the imaginary cannot be properly dialectically mediated. Instead, the real is the name for that which fills the gap between the imaginary and the symbolic. In other words, the real is not excessive or outside to the imaginary or the symbolic. It is constitutive. It lies within the gap between the imaginary is symbolic and the symbolic is imaginary. And one of the key sequences in Lacan that I think a lot of people don't always notice is that he argues that it's not just the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Instead, we have to have the imaginary of the imaginary of the symbolic, and the imaginary of the real. Likewise, we have the symbolic of the real, the imaginary of the real, and the real of the real. We also have, you can see how this works. It's essentially like he takes this idea of what appears to be a formalistic exercise between 1, 2, 3, imaginary, symbolic, real, which many people would thereby falsely assume relates to thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and he dialectizes it. In other words, in very Jamesonian fashion, Frederick Jameson, we have here the question, what is the dialectic of the dialectic itself? The dialectic of the dialectic itself is code for Hegelian speculative idealism. It's not the formalistic transition from thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or content into form, into content mediated as form, but instead precisely the manner in which content emerges only within the gap between form and content itself. In other words, Zizek posits that we can make an analogy between the Lacanian real, which emerges within what he calls the parallax gap, between the imaginary and the symbolic, namely between the idea of content and form. And even for Lacan, you can see the structural relation to this, which is that imaginary, your imaginary relation to yourself, which Lacan posits in the mirror stage, namely the discovery of yourself as other, is thereby the discovery of form. That's very bad. Discovery as content. And then the symbolic is how you realize the content through the interactions with other into form. In other words, social relations. And thereby for Lacan, we have the exact same problem, which is that the only way in which content, the imaginary relation to self, is made manifest is by its apparent negation through symbolic relation to others. Hence also why Lacan argues that you are your own mask. You can't say that your imaginary self is your true self, your symbolic self is your fake self. It's only through the fall into the symbolic self that the imaginary, i.e. true self, emerges. The gap between this irreconcilable division, is what Lacan calls the real. And thereby you can understand why Zizek takes the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real of Lacan and uses it as a way to read thesis, antithesis, synthesis in a Hegelian speculative fashion, thereby to argue, this is my final point, that the transition of philosophy proper is the transition from naive transcendentalism towards self-reflective critical transcendentalism, i.e. Kantian formalism, towards speculative psychoanalytic idealism, namely the idealism of the real, or the transcendentalism of the real. Not the manner in which the real is that which is itself the final point of the form and content, but itself the irredeemable, untraversable horizon of the necessary gap, the constitutive negativity, if you will, within the mediation of form and content itself. And to link that all the way back to the problem of postmodernism, here we realize how postmodernism, in an almost Fichtean fashion, becomes a spurious infinity. Remember, Fichte posits that the absolute, the idea of content, has to be put all the way back, that we simply have to go through the motions of perpetual form, and that we simply put content at the very end of the trajectory. In other words, it elevates form to the level of content as such, in the same way that the urinal is the object elevated to the level of the thing, the profane object elevated into art. And thereby we have the slightly problematic aspect within postmodernism is that instead of finding this moment of the absolute, this transcendental mediation, it simply becomes a perpetual, spuriously infinite repetition of increasing layers of meta-narrative. And what's funny is that, like, a lot of conservatives and even reactionary thinkers thereby accuse postmodernism of being relative. And yet it is precisely not relative. It's almost the exact opposite of relative. Relative means that anything can mean anything. Anything can become anything. And yet the whole postmodern argument is that nothing ever becomes. That nothing ever becomes what it is meant to be. In other words, it posits that the difference between form and content, that differentiation or différence for the structuralists, becomes itself universalized. That is exactly what Lacan means when he argues that the only universal is difference as such. Now, I know I'm going over time here, but in the seminar we can talk more about why Lacan remains a structuralist and not a postmodernist. Because the argument that Lacan thereby doesn't make is that this means that identity should simply be stretched into a kind of infinite horizon where you could be anything. Instead, for Lacan, the whole point is to say that this universalization of difference is itself what authenticity, true self, looks like. In the exact same way that for Hegel, it's precisely the fact that the universal, the weak nature as he calls it, has to be sublated into its seeming irreconcilable other, the idea of the subject. And so rather than positing that we have a spurious infinitive by which we have the absolute or content or the idea of the real posited behind the transcendental horizon, the transcendental horizon is upheld with the idea of the dialectic that dialecticizes itself, the real of the transcendental, as it were. And so the argument that Zizek makes is that in order to understand Hegel, you have to understand that it is specifically about the manner in which there is a content that is unique to the irreconcilable antithesis between form and content itself. To put that in Fichtean terms, between thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, we don't arrive at antithesis, but that thesis is itself always already a pre-mediated antithesis of its own negation. In other words, that rather than having a spurious infinity by which we emerge eventually at the moment of the end of history, of synthesis, instead, It is precisely that synthesis is always already occurring within the positing of negation within that which is currently given, the thesis. And so it's not a movement of 1, 2, 3. It's not a formal narrative linear structure. That is the transition from naive transcendental idealism towards self-reflective Kantian transcendental idealism towards Hegelian speculative idealism. It's a lot to do in 50 minutes, admittedly, but I hope that this lecture has shed some light, at least on modernism, postmodernism, some psychoanalysis, some philosophy, some Zizek, all that and more. I'm going to be hosting a Q&A right after this in about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to get a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to be hosting a seminar, a Q&A discussion on Discord for our patrons. If you'd like to join us, it's just $5 to join, to become a patron. And I'm also going to post that discussion as a podcast for patrons. So if you'd like to go a little bit deeper into these ideas, if you'd like to implement them into your own studies and learning, please do consider becoming a patron. It makes such a difference. Like, it's a little thing, but it makes a huge difference. So if you'd like to be part of our learning community on Patreon, I invite you. There's so much more to learn here. There's so much more to unpack and discuss. We can talk more about art. We can talk more about philosophy. I'm excited about it. But for now, thank you for listening to this lecture. And if you'd like to become a patron, simply go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julie. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next week.